Martha Jefferson stood at a tall window on the second floor of Monticello, her palm resting against the chilled pane as though the glass might steady her. Below, on the narrow path that curved toward the slave quarters, she watched her husband walking beside a young woman. The girl's cotton dress hung simply from her shoulders, but the subtle swell beneath the fabric was unmistakable now. Thomas did not touch her. He did not meet her eyes, yet the distance he maintained, careful, deliberate, revealed more than any gesture could have. Martha knew that space well, nearly 3 feet. She had counted it in her mind over weeks of silent observation. Some truths announced themselves without words. She had suspected for months the way Sally Hemings moved through the house as though something within her had settled, grown certain, the way Thomas's gaze lingered on her when he believed himself unseen, the way voices lowered or stopped entirely. When Martha entered a room, the way Sally's dresses had been altered twice in quick succession, the stitches hidden neatly, though not neatly enough to escape the notice of a woman who knew what to look for. Suspicion, however, was not the same as proof. Martha caught her reflection in the glass. Her face was pale, drawn tight over bone. 6 pregnancies had hollowed her body, and the pain in her chest, unrelenting, unexplained, had aged her far beyond her years. She was 33 and looked closer to 50. Sally was 16. She carried youth easily, health effortlessly, and something else as well, something that had once belonged unquestionably to Martha. Her breath fogged the window. When the glass cleared, Thomas and Sally had vanished around the corner of the dependencies. Martha remained there long after, staring at the empty path as the sun sank low and shadows stretched across the Virginia hills. That night she began to write letters she never sent, letters that would vanish as completely as she eventually did, letters that left behind only questions that would echo for centuries. What happened to Martha Jefferson in the spring of 1782? Why did a woman who had rarely left her husband's side disappear from the historical record for 3 critical months? And why, when she returned, was she changed, quiet, distant, hollowed out as though something essential had been taken from her? The answers lie buried in Virginia's red clay, in the spaces between what history chose to record and what it chose to forget. This is a story of a wife, a slave, a founding father, and a secret so dangerous it had to be erased from letters, documents, and memory itself. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of surfacing. If you want to hear more disturbing stories from America's hidden past, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what comes next may force you to question everything you thought you knew about the men who built this nation. Monticello in early 1782 was not yet the architectural masterpiece it would become. The main house was still under construction, a work perpetually in progress that reflected Thomas Jefferson's restless mind. Exposed beams jutted from unfinished walls. Scaffolding clung to the western facade. The smell of fresh-cut timber and wet plaster permeated every room. Workers, both hired craftsmen and enslaved laborers, moved through the structure like ghosts, building the monument that would eventually imprison them all in different ways. Thomas Jefferson, then 38 years old, had returned from his tumultuous tenure as Virginia's wartime governor to find his home half-built and his wife declining in health. The Revolutionary War still raged, though the fighting had moved south. British forces under Cornwallis had invaded Virginia the previous year, forcing Jefferson to flee Richmond in what his political enemies called cowardice and his supporters called prudence. The experience had left him shaken, eager to retreat into private life and the intellectual pursuits that had always been his true passion. But private life at Monticello was anything but peaceful. Martha Wales Skelton. Jefferson had married Thomas 10 years earlier in 1772, bringing with her not only a substantial inheritance, but also 135 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings and her children, including a daughter named Sally, who was just an infant then. The whispers about the Hemings family had started long before Martha married Thomas. Everyone in Virginia society knew, though no one spoke of it openly, that Elizabeth Hemings's children were fathered by John Wales, Martha's father, which meant that Elizabeth's daughter Sally was Martha's half-sister, connected by blood but separated by the brutal mathematics of slavery. Martha had grown up with this knowledge. She had watched her father move between the main house and the slave quarters with the casual entitlement of a man who owned not just labor, but bodies, futures, bloodlines. She had seen her mother's face grow tight and distant whenever Elizabeth Hemings appeared. She had learned early that some truths were acknowledged through silence rather than speech. When Martha's mother died, John Wales had taken Elizabeth Hemings as his concubine openly. No longer bothering with pretense, he fathered 6 more children with her, each one a living reminder of the system's fundamental corruption. Martha, barely a teenager, had been forced to accept these half-siblings as property, to give them orders to participate in the fiction that blood meant nothing when it crossed the color line. She had promised herself that her own. Marriage would be different, that Thomas, with his enlightened ideas about liberty and human dignity, would never replicate her father's behavior. She had been wrong. The plantation operated with the brutal efficiency common to Virginia estates of the period. Nearly 200 enslaved people worked the tobacco fields, the vegetable gardens, the nail factory, the textile workshop, and the house itself. They built the walls that would imprison them. They cooked the food for tables they would never sit at. They raised children who would never be their own. They created wealth they would never benefit from, building an empire of ideas about freedom on a foundation of bondage. Thomas Jefferson kept meticulous records of everything: crop yields, weather patterns, construction progress, the births and deaths of enslaved people tracked with the same attention he gave to his garden vegetables. His journals from this period survive in various archives. Thousands of pages of careful observations about soil composition and architectural theory and philosophical musings on liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But from March through May of 1782, there are only blank pages. 12 weeks of silence in a record that was otherwise obsessively complete. 12 weeks that Thomas Jefferson wanted erased from history. Martha had given birth to their 6th child, Lucy Elizabeth, in May of 1781. The delivery had been difficult, complicated by Martha's weakened constitution and the primitive medical care available even to wealthy families. The doctor had used forceps, causing internal injuries that never properly healed. Martha hemorrhaged for weeks afterward, losing so much blood that she couldn't stand without fainting. She survived, but she never recovered. She spent most days in bed, too weak to walk more than a few steps without assistance. The pain in her abdomen was constant, a dull ache that sharp. Ned into agony whenever she moved. The doctors came and went, a parade of men with confident diagnosis and useless treatments. They prescribed laudanum for the pain, which helped but left her mind foggy and disconnected. They prescribed bloodletting for the weakness, which only made her weaker. They prescribed bed rest and fresh air and various tonics that tasted like poison and probably were. Nothing helped. Martha was dying slowly, and everyone knew it. Thomas hired additional house servants to care for her. Sally Hemings, who had just turned 15, was brought up from the weaving house where she had been learning textile work. She was assigned light duties, bringing meals to Martha's room, changing linens, reading aloud when Martha's eyes grew too tired, sitting quietly in case Martha needed anything. Sally was unusually beautiful, with light skin inherited from her white father and delicate features that made visitors mistake her for a member of the family rather than property. She had hazel eyes unusual in the slave quarters and hair that fell in soft waves rather than tight curls. She was also intelligent, quick to learn, observant in a way that made some people uncomfortable. She could read, a skill Elizabeth Hemings had secretly taught her children despite the laws against slave literacy. She could play the harpsichord, having learned by listening to Martha's lessons and practicing when the family was away. Martha, in her illness, grew attached to the girl. Sally reminded her of herself at that age, before marriage, before children, before the slow erosion of hope that comes from loving a man who loves ideas more than people. She taught Sally French, reading to her from Voltaire and Rousseau, enjoying the irony of teaching Enlightenment philosophy to a girl who had no rights at all. They would sit together for hours, Martha in her bed and Sally in a chair beside it die, discussing ideas that both of them knew would never change Sally's fundamental status as property. But Thomas saw something different in Sally, something that would destroy everything. It began in February of 1782, during one of the coldest winters Virginia had seen in decades. Ice formed on the inside of windows, creating crystalline patterns that looked like frozen flowers. The James River froze solid for the first time in living memory, thick enough that people walked across it. The enslaved people in the quarters burned through their meager wood supplies in the first 2 weeks and spent the rest of the winter huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. 3 children died of pneumonia in a single week. Their bodies were buried in ground so frozen that the gravediggers had to light fires to soften the earth enough to dig. Martha's condition worsened with the cold. She could no longer leave her bed at all. Her skin took on a gray pallor that made her look like she was already dead. Her breathing became labored, each breath a visible effort. She coughed constantly, bringing up blood that stained her handkerchiefs. The doctors said it was consumption, though they couldn't explain why the usual treatments had no effect. They began to speak in hushed tones about making her comfortable, about preparing the family for the inevitable. Thomas spent his days in his study supposedly working on revisions to the Virginia legal code. He had been asked to reform the state's laws to bring them in line with Republican principles. It was work that should have consumed him, the kind of intellectual challenge he normally relished. But the house servants noticed that he seemed distracted, that pages sat on his desk for days without being touched, that he stared out the window for hours at a time. They also noticed that Sally Hemings was often sent to bring him tea, to stoke his fire, to deliver messages that could have been delivered by anyone. And they noticed that these errands took longer than they should. Sally would disappear into the study with a tea tray and not emerge for an hour. The door would be closed. No sounds would come from within. And when Sally finally emerged, her face would be flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes carefully avoiding everyone else's gaze. The other house servants began to whisper. Betty Brown, who had served the Jefferson family for 20 years, told her daughter that she had seen Thomas touch Sally's hand when she brought him tea, a lingering touch that went beyond courtesy. Ursula, the cook, said she had heard voices from the study late at night, Thomas's low murmur and Sally's softer responses. Martin Hemings, Sally's brother and Thomas's personal servant, said nothing, but his face grew tight and angry whenever Sally's name was mentioned. Martha noticed, too. Even through the fog of laudanum, she saw the way Thomas looked at Sally. She heard the footsteps in the hallway late at night, the soft closing of doors, the whispered conversations that stopped when she called out. She noticed that Sally had new dresses, better fabric than the other house servants wore. She noticed that Sally was excused from the hardest work, that she was given privileges that created resentment among the other enslaved people, and she noticed with a sick certainty that cut through the laudanum haze that Sally's body was changing. The girl's breasts were fuller, her face had a certain glow, her dresses were being let out at the waist. Sally Hemings was pregnant in early March. Martha summoned her sister Elizabeth Epps to Monticello. The message was urgent, carried by a rider through freezing rain. Elizabeth arrived 2 days later to find Martha in a state of agitation, unusual for someone so ill. Mart. Ha was sitting up in bed, her eyes bright with fever or fury or both. She had refused her lord that morning, wanting her mind clear. Martha dismissed the servants and spoke to her sister in urgent whispers for over an hour. The door was closed, but Betty Brown, who was cleaning in the hallway, heard fragments of the conversation. She heard Martha say, "Pregnant and my own house and my father's daughter." She heard Elizabeth's shocked responses, her attempts to calm Martha, her suggestions that Martha might be mistaken. But Martha was not mistaken. She had evidence. She had been watching, documenting, keeping track of dates and times and observations in a small journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress. She had recorded every time Sally went to Thomas's study, every time Thomas visited the slave quarters at night, every time Sally's dresses were altered. She had calculated the dates and determined that Sally was approximately 3 months pregnant. And she had a plan. No record exists of what exactly Martha told her sister that day, But Elizabeth left Monticello that same afternoon, her face pale and drawn, and she never spoke of the visit to anyone. She rode away in the rain, and she did not look back at the house. 2 days later, Sally Hemings appeared at breakfast with a bruise on her cheek, dark purple spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw. When Betty Brown asked what happened, Sally said she had fallen on the ice, but there was no ice in the house, and Sally's eyes told a different story. They were red from crying, and they held a fear that went beyond physical pain. That night, Martha Jefferson left her bed for the first time in weeks. Several servants saw her walking through the house in her nightgown, carrying a candle, moving with surprising strength for someone supposedly dying. Her face was set in an expression of grim determination. She went to Thomas's S. Tootie. The door closed. Voices were raised, Martha's high and sharp, cutting through the walls. Thomas's low and defensive, trying to calm her. The argument lasted over an hour. Servants gathered in the hallways, pretending to work while straining to hear. They caught fragments. Your own house, my father's child, everyone will know, destroy everything. Then silence. A long, terrible silence that was somehow worse than the shouting. When the door finally opened, Thomas emerged alone. His face was composed, carefully neutral, but his hands were shaking. He ordered all the servants to bed immediately. His voice was cold, brooking no argument. The servants scattered, but they watched from windows and doorways as Thomas locked himself in his study for the rest of the night. A single candle burned in the window until dawn. The next morning, Martha Jefferson was gone. Thomas gathered the household staff in the main hall at sunrise. His face was haggarded, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his voice was steady. He announced that Martha had been taken to a specialist doctor in Richmond during the night. Her condition had deteriorated suddenly, he explained, and she required treatment that could only be provided in the city. She would be gone for several weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, the household was to continue operating normally. No one was to discuss Martha's absence with visitors. Anyone who spread rumors would be severely punished. The servants listened in silence. They knew better than to ask questions, but they also knew the story made no sense. First, Martha was far too ill to travel. The journey to Richmond was over 70 miles on rough roads, a trip that would take 3 days minimum in good weather. In March, with the roads muddy from rain and snow, it could take a week. The constant jostling of the carriage, the exposure to cold and damp, the lack of proper res. Any of these things could easily kill someone in Martha's condition. No doctor would recommend such a journey. No husband who cared about his wife's survival would allow it. Second, if Martha had truly been taken to Richmond, there would have been preparation, trunks packed with her belongings, arrangements made for her care, messages sent ahead to secure lodging and alert the doctor. But none of this had happened. Martha's room looked exactly as it had the night before, her clothes still in the wardrobe, her personal items still on the dressing table. If she had left for an extended stay in Richmond, she had taken nothing with her. Third, Thomas made no attempt to visit her. For a man supposedly devoted to his dying wife, he showed remarkable indifference to her treatment. He remained at Monticello, overseeing construction, managing the plantation, and spending an unusual amount of time in the slave quarters. He sent no letters to Richmond asking about Martha's condition. He received no updates from the supposed doctor. He acted like a man who knew exactly where his wife was and had no concerns about her well-being. The enslaved community at Monticello had their own theories about what happened. These theories were passed down through generations, whispered in the quarters late at night, never written down but never forgotten. They were shared in the careful code that enslaved people developed. For discussing dangerous truths, oblique references, meaningful silences, stories that seemed to be about other people but were really about the masters. They said Martha had discovered the truth about Thomas and Sally. They said she had confronted him with evidence that could destroy his reputation, a man who wrote about liberty while forcing himself on an enslaved girl who was his wife's half-sister. They said Thomas had been forced to choose between his reputation and his wife. And they said he had chosen his reputation. But where was Martha? If she hadn't gone to Richmond, where had she been taken? And why did Thomas go to such lengths to conceal her location? The answer lay in a place that no longer appears on any map, a place that was deliberately erased from history along with Martha herself. Approximately 30 miles west of Monticello, deep in the mountains that formed the spine of Virginia, there was a small settlement called Shadwell Mills. It had been founded by Peter Jefferson, Thomas's father, in the 1740s as a commercial venture. The settlement consisted of a grist mill powered by a fast-moving creek, a few outbuildings for storage and equipment, and a stone house set back from the road on a small rise. The house was substantial, built to last, with thick walls of local fieldstone and a slate roof that could withstand the harsh mountain winters. It had been intended as a residence for the mill manager, but the mill had never been profitable. The settlement was too remote, too difficult to reach, too far from the main trade routes. By 1760, the mill had been abandoned. The outbuildings fell into disrepair. The stone house stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Thomas inherited the property when his father died, but he rarely visited it. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a narrow path that was often impossible in winter and spring. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear completely, where screams would be swallowed by the forest, where no one would ever know what happened behind those thick stone walls. In March of 1782, smoke was seen rising from the stone house's chimney for the first time in years. A local hunter named William Crawford, tracking deer through the mountains, noticed it and thought it strange. He approached cautiously and saw that the house had been recently occupied. The windows had been shuttered from the inside. Fresh firewood was stacked by the door. A carriage stood in what had once been a yard, now overgrown with weeds. Crawford watched from the tree for over an hour. He saw 2 enslaved men from Monticello. He recognized them from having sold game to the plantation, carrying supplies into the house, water from the creek, firewood, a basket that looked like it contained food. They moved with the careful efficiency of men performing an unpleasant duty, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Then Crawford heard something that made his blood run cold, a woman's voice, high and desperate, screaming from inside the house. The words were indistinct, but the anguish was unmistakable. The scream went on, rising in pitch until it cut off abruptly as if someone had covered the woman's mouth. The 2 enslaved men stopped what they were doing. They looked at each other, their faces carefully blank. Then they finished unloading the supplies and left, driving the carriage back down the narrow path toward Monticello. Crawford waited until they were gone, then approached the house. He tried to look through the shuttered windows, but they were sealed tight. He tried the door, but it was locked from the outside, a heavy padlock that would require a key to open. He called out, asking if anyone needed help, but received no response. He rode into the nearest town and mentioned what he had seen to a friend at the tavern. The friend, a man named Robert Hughes, who had business dealings with Jefferson, told Crawford that he must have been mistaken. There was no one at Shadwell Mills. The property had been abandoned for years. Perhaps Crawford had seen squatters, or perhaps the isolation of the mountains had played tricks on his mind. But Crawford knew what he had seen, and he knew what he had heard. A woman was being held in that stone house against her will, and everyone seemed determined to pretend it wasn't happening. Within a week, rumors were spreading through Albemarle County. People whispered that Thomas Jefferson was keeping his wife prisoner in the mountains. They said Martha had gone mad and had to be restrained for her own safety. They said she had tried to kill herself and was being prevented from trying again. They said she had discovered something about Thomas that he couldn't allow her to reveal. Now, Thomas moved quickly to suppress the rumors. He visited Robert Hughes personally and suggested that spreading false stories about a governor's family could be considered sedition, a serious crime in wartime Virginia. He reminded Hughes that he had the power to make life very difficult for people who worked against him. Hughes understood the message and stopped talking about Shadwell Mills. Thomas also visited the tavern where Crawford had first mentioned the stone house. He spoke to the owner, a man named Samuel Porter, and made it clear that he would appreciate Porter's discretion. He didn't threaten directly. Thomas Jefferson was too sophisticated for crude threats, but he mentioned that he was reviewing the tavern licenses in the county and that some establishments might not meet the new standards he was considering. Porter got the message. When Crawford came back to the tavern and tried to talk about what he had seen, Porter told him to keep quiet. He said that some things were better left alone, that powerful men had long memories, that a hunter who wanted to keep hunting on Jefferson's land should learn when to keep his mouth shut. Crawford was offered a generous payment, £50, more money than he could make in a year, to leave Virginia and start fresh in Kentucky. The money came from Thomas Jefferson's personal account, though the transaction was handled through an intermediary, so there would be no direct connection. Crawford accepted. He left Virginia in April of 1782 and was never heard from again. Whether he actually made it to Kentucky or whether he met with an accident along the way, no one knows. The two enslaved men who had been stationed at Shadwell Mills, Jupiter Evans and George Granger, were sold to a plantation in Georgia within a month of Martha's disappearance. The sale was unusual because both men were skilled workers valuable to the plantation and had families at Monticello. Selling them meant breaking up families, separating husbands from wives and fathers from children, which Thomas Jefferson publicly claimed to avoid whenever possible. But Jupiter and George knew what had happened in that stone house. They had seen Martha Jefferson in her captivity. They had heard her screams and her pleas. They had been forced to participate in her imprisonment, bringing her food and water and firewood, maintaining the fiction that she was being cared for when she was really being broken. They were sent 1,000 miles away to a place where no one would believe their stories, even if they dared to tell them. They were separated from everyone they knew, isolated in a new and hostile environment, their knowledge buried with them. Jupiter died in 1790. Killed in an accident at the Georgia plantation. George lived until 1808, but he never spoke about his time at Shadwell Mills. The knowledge died with him, or so Thomas Jefferson believed. But one person knew the truth. One person had been there at Shadwell Mills during those first terrible weeks. One person had seen Martha in her captivity, had heard her accusations and her threats, had witnessed the systematic destruction of a woman's mind and spirit. Sally Hemings knew, and Sally Hemings was pregnant with Thomas Jefferson's child. By April, Sally's condition could no longer be hidden. Her belly swelled beneath her dresses, visible to anyone who looked. The other enslaved women in the house began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of sympathy and resentment. Some felt sorry for Sally. She was just a child herself, barely 16. And everyone knew she had no choice in what happened to her. The master wanted her, and an enslaved woman had no right to refuse. It was rape by definition, though no one used that word. They called it taking advantage or having his way or simply what masters do. Others were resentful. They saw in Sally's pregnancy a kind of favor, a closeness to the master that might bring privileges. Sally had already been given better quarters, excused from field work, provided with nicer clothing. Now she would have the master's child, and that child might be treated differently than other enslaved children. It created a hierarchy within the slave community, a division between those who had the master's favor and those who didn't. Sally herself said nothing. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing her duties with mechanical efficiency, her face carefully blank. She didn't complain about her condition. She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't confide in anyone about what had happened between her and Thomas Jefferson. She simply endured as enslaved women had endured for generations, carrying a burden she had never chosen and could never escape. Thomas said nothing publicly about Sally's condition, but he made arrangements. Sally was moved from the main house to a small cabin near the stables, away from the other servants. The cabin was better than most slave quarters. It had a wooden floor instead of dirt, a proper fireplace instead of a fire pit, a real bed instead of a straw pallet. Sally was given her food, warmer blankets, and excused from all heavy work. A midwife was assigned to check on her regularly, ensuring that the pregnancy progressed normally. These small kindnesses were noted by everyone and understood by no one. Why was Thomas Jefferson taking such care of an enslaved girl's pregnancy? He had never shown such concern for the dozens of other enslaved women at Monticello who had given birth over the years. Their pregnancies were recorded in his farm book with the same attention he gave to the breeding of livestock. A note about the date, the sex of the child, whether mother and baby survived. But Sally was different. Sally was receiving the kind of care usually reserved for family members. The whispers grew louder. People began to speculate openly about the baby's paternity. Some said it was Thomas Jefferson's child, pointing to the special treatment as evidence. Others said that was impossible, that a man of Jefferson's stature would never stoop to such behavior, that Sally must have been involved with one of the enslaved men, and Jefferson was simply being charitable. But the enslaved community knew the truth. They had seen Thomas visiting Sally's cabin at night. They had seen the way he looked at her, the way he touched her hand when he thought no one was watching. They had heard Sally crying in her cabin after his visits, soft sobs that she tried to muffle so no one would hear. They knew exactly what was happening, and they knew there was nothing they could do about it. In late April, a letter arrived at Monticello from Elizabeth Epps, Martha's sister. The letter was formal and cold, very different from Elizabeth's usual warm correspondence. She was demanding to see her sister. She had written to the supposed doctor in Richmond and received no reply. She had sent messages to several other doctors in the city asking if they were treating Martha J. Jefferson, and all had responded that they had no such patient. She was threatening to come to Monticello herself and search for Martha, to involve other family members to make inquiries with the Virginia government about Martha's whereabouts. Thomas wrote back immediately. His letter, which survives in the EPS family archives, is a masterpiece of misdirection and subtle threat. He assured Elizabeth that Martha was receiving excellent care, that her condition was improving slowly, that she would return home as soon as she was strong enough to travel. He begged Elizabeth to be patient, to trust him, to understand that Martha needed complete rest and isolation to recover. Any disruption, any visitors, any stress could set back her recovery or even kill her. He also mentioned almost casually that he had recently revised his will. He had made generous provisions for Elizabeth and her children, ensuring that they would be financially secure even if something happened to him. He hoped she would find the arrangement satisfactory. He enclosed a copy of the relevant sections, showing exactly how much money Elizabeth stood to inherit. The implication was clear. Silence could be bought. Elizabeth's cooperation would be rewarded. Her interference would cost her dearly. Elizabeth did not come to Monticello, but she also did not stop asking questions. She wrote to friends in Richmond, to doctors, to anyone who might have information about Martha's whereabouts. She was careful, diplomatic, never directly accusing Thomas of anything improper, but her persistence was dangerous. She was creating a record of her concerns, a paper trail that could be used against Thomas if Martha never returned or returned in a condition that raised questions. Thomas needed Martha to reappear, but the woman locked in the stone house at Shadwell Mills was no longer capable of playing the role of Virginia. First Lady, the servants who had been sent to care for Martha in her isolation, a rotation of enslaved women who were brought to Shadwell Mills for a few days at a time and then returned to Monticello, brought back disturbing reports. They whispered to each other in the quarters late at night, sharing what they had seen in voices barely above a whisper. Martha had stopped eating. She would take a few bites of food and then push the plate away, saying it was poisoned. She had lost so much weight that her bones showed through her skin. Her hair, which had once been thick and lustrous, was falling out in clumps. She had torn out patches of it herself, leaving bald spots on her scalp. She spent hours staring at the stone walls, not speaking, not responding to questions. Sometimes she would suddenly start talking, rapid streams of words that made no sense, fragments of prayers and accusations and pleas for mercy all jumbled together. She talked about Sally, about the baby, about betrayal and revenge. She talked about her father, about the Hemmings family, about the fundamental corruption of the system they all lived in. and she had scratched words into the stone walls with her fingernails. The women who saw these scratches were horrified. Some were Bible verses about adultery and punishment. Some were accusations against Thomas, calling him a hypocrite and a liar. Some were threats, promises of revenge that Martha would never be able to carry out, and some were simply, "Please, let me out. Please, let me out. I'll be good. I'll be quiet. Just let me out." Her fingernails were broken and bloody from scratching at the stone. The women tried to bandage her hands, but Martha would tear off the bandages and start scratching again. It was as if she was trying to claw her way through the walls to escape through sheer force of will. A doctor was brought to examine her, not a Richam. On specialist, but a discreet physician from Stunton named Dr. William Carr, who was known for treating difficult cases and keeping secrets. Dr. Carr spent an hour with Martha and emerged looking shaken. He told Thomas that Martha was suffering from severe melancholia, possibly complicated by brain fever. Her mind had been damaged perhaps permanently by the combination of physical illness, emotional trauma, and isolation. Dr. Carr recommended continued isolation, laudanum for agitation and prayer. He said that Martha might recover with time or she might not. He said that bringing her back into society in her current condition would be disastrous. She would make wild accusations, behave inappropriately, embarrass the family. Better to keep her isolated until she either recovered or died. He did not recommend that she be returned to her family. He did not suggest that she be allowed visitors. He did not question why a woman supposedly receiving medical treatment was being kept locked in an abandoned house in the mountains rather than in a proper hospital or sanatorium. Dr. Carr was paid £100 for his consultation and his silence. He returned to Stunton and never spoke of Martha Jefferson again. When he died in 1795, his personal papers were burned by his widow, who said only that her husband had treated many patients whose privacy needed to be protected even after death. But Thomas had no choice. Elizabeth's questions were attracting attention. Other family members were beginning to ask why they hadn't heard from Martha in months. Visitors to Monticello were commenting on her absence, expressing concern, offering to help. The fiction of the Richmond doctor was becoming impossible to maintain. Someone would eventually go to Richmond and search for Martha themselves, and when they found no trace of her, the questions would become accusations. In mid-May, Thomas made a decis ion. Martha would return to Monticello, but she would return changed, broken, incapable of telling anyone what had happened to her. The question was, had she already been broken by 3 months of isolation and grief, or did Thomas take additional steps to ensure her silence? On May 20th, 1782, Martha Jefferson returned to Monticello. She arrived at dawn, brought in a closed carriage that went directly to the main house without stopping. The servants were ordered to stay in their quarters until after sunrise. No one was to see her arrival. No one was to speak of it. But enslaved people have ways of seeing things they're not supposed to see. They have to for survival. Their lives depend on knowing what the masters are doing, on anticipating moods and movements, on being invisible while remaining aware of everything. A young girl named Betsy, who worked in the kitchen, was up early starting the fires for breakfast. She had to be. The bread needed to be baked. The porridge needed to be cooked. The coffee needed to be ready when the family woke. She was carrying wood from the shed to the kitchen when she saw the carriage arrive. She stopped in the shadows, making herself small and still, and watched. Thomas climbed out of the carriage first. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled, his face haggard. He had been gone for 2 days, supposedly on business in Charlottesville, but everyone knew he had really gone to Shadwell Mills to bring Martha home. He reached into the carriage and helped a woman out. The woman moved slowly, uncertainly, like someone who had forgotten how to walk. She was so thin that she looked like a skeleton dressed in clothes. Her dress hung on her frame several sizes too large. Her face was hollow, her cheeks sunken, her eyes enormous in her gaunt face. But it was her hair that shocked Betsy the most. Martha Jefferson's hair had once been thick and dark. Her pride and joy. The woman who emerged from the carriage had hair that was streaked with white as if she had aged 30 years and 3 months. It was thin and brittle, and there were patches where it had fallen out completely, leaving visible scalp. Thomas supported her with one arm around her waist, practically carrying her up the steps to the house. The woman, Martha, though she barely looked like herself, didn't speak. She didn't look around. She moved like a puppet, mechanically following Thomas's guidance, her eyes fixed on nothing. Betsy said later, much later, when she was an old woman and Thomas Jefferson was long dead and she had nothing left to fear, that the woman who returned to Monticello was not the same woman who had left. She said it was like Martha's soul had been taken out and something else put in its place, something hollow and broken that wore Martha's face, but wasn't really her anymore. Martha was installed in her bedroom on the second floor, the same room she had occupied before her disappearance. But now the room had been modified. The windows had been fitted with locks on the outside. The door had a new lock as well, one that could only be opened with a key that Thomas kept on his person at all times. The furniture had been reduced to essentials: a bed, a chair, a small table, nothing that could be used as a weapon, nothing that could be broken into sharp pieces. A nurse was hired to care for Martha. Her name was Mrs. Abigail Randolph, a stern woman from Charlottesville who had experience with difficult patients. She had worked in a private asylum in Philadelphia before returning to Virginia, and she brought with her the methods used in such institutions: restraints for violent patients, sedatives for agitation, isolation for those who couldn't be controlled. Mrs. Randolph moved into a small room adjacent to Martha's, connected by a door that as kept locked from the nurse's side. She was given complete authority over Martha's care. She decided when Martha ate, when she slept, when she was allowed out of bed. She administered laudanum several times a day, keeping Martha in a constant state of sedation. She kept detailed records of Martha's condition, noting every episode of agitation, every refusal to eat, every inappropriate statement. These records survive in the Randolph family papers. They make for disturbing reading. Mrs. Randolph described Martha as violently agitated, prone to fits of weeping, making wild accusations against her husband, and requiring constant supervision to prevent self-harm. She noted that Martha frequently refused food, claiming it was poisoned. She recorded that Martha had to be restrained on several occasions when she tried to leave her room or harm herself, but the records also reveal something else. They show that Martha had moments of lucidity, times when the laudanum wore off and her mind cleared. During these moments, she would tell Mrs. Randolph what had happened to her. She would describe her time at Shadwell Mills, the isolation, the fear, the systematic breaking of her will. She would talk about Sally Hemings and the baby, about Thomas's betrayal, about her determination to expose the truth. Mrs. Randolph recorded these statements in her notes, but she also noted that Martha was delusional and not to be believed. She characterized Martha's accusations as the ravings of a diseased mind rather than the testimony of a woman who had been imprisoned and abused. Whether Mrs. Randolph actually believed Martha was delusional or whether she was simply protecting her employer is impossible to know. The household was told that Martha's condition had worsened during her treatment in Richmond, that she needed complete quiet and rest, that only Thomas and Mrs. Randolph were to enter our room. The servants were forbidden from speaking to Martha or even acknowledging her presence. If they heard her crying or calling out, they were to ignore it and continue with their work. For the next 3 months, Martha Jefferson was a ghost in her own home. Servants would hear her crying at night, long wailing sobs that echoed through the hallways and made them pull their blankets over their heads to block out the sound. They would hear her calling out names, her children's names, her sister's name, and sometimes, in a voice filled with venom, Sally's name. Sally Hemings. I know you can hear me. I know what you did. I know what he did. Everyone will know. I'll make sure everyone knows. Thomas spent every evening in Martha's room. The servants could hear him through the door, reading to her in low, soothing tones, trying to calm her agitation. He read from the Bible, from philosophy texts, from poetry. He spoke to her about their children, about their life together, about his love for her. He tried to reach whatever was left of the woman he had married. But they could also hear Martha's responses, Accusations, curses, desperate questions that Thomas never answered adequately. Why did you send me away? Why did you lock me in that place? What did you do to me there? What did you give me? Why won't you let me see my children? What have you told them about me? Is the baby born yet? Is it a boy or a girl? Does it look like you? Everyone will know. I'll tell everyone. You can't keep me locked up forever. Thomas's responses were always the same. He told her she was ill, that she needed rest, that she was confused and saying things she didn't mean. He told her that she would feel better soon, that she would recover, that everything would be all right. He told her that he loved her, that he had always loved her, that he had only done what was necessary to protect her and the family. But Martha didn't believe him, and she never stopped trying to escape. Martha's children had not been allowed to see her since before her disappearance. Patty, who was 9 years old, and Polly, who was 3, were told their mother was too ill to see them. They were sent to stay with relatives. Patty with her Aunt Elizabeth Epps. Polly with another family member. They would not see Martha again until it was too late. Patty wrote letters to her mother, childish notes expressing love and hope for her recovery. These letters were given to Thomas, who promised to read them to Martha. Whether he actually did is unknown. The letters survive in the Jefferson family papers, but there are no responses from Martha, no messages of love for her daughters, no reassurances that she would see them soon, just silence. In July, Sally Hemings went into labor. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 2 days. Sally was attended by Grace, the plantation midwife, an elderly enslaved woman who had delivered dozens of babies at Monticello over the years. Grace had delivered Martha's children. She had delivered Sally's mother's children. She had seen generations of enslaved families born into bondage, and she had learned to keep her thoughts to herself about what she witnessed. But what she saw during Sally's delivery shocked even her. The baby was born healthy and strong, a boy with light skin and delicate features. But it was the baby's face that made Grace catch her breath. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the particular way the baby's hair grew at the temples, all of it was unmistakably familiar. The baby looked like Thomas Jefferson. Not just a general resemblance, but a specific, undeniable similarity that could not be explained away. Grace said nothing. She cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Sally's arms. Sally looked down at her son with an expression that was hard to read. Love, certainly, but also fear and resignation. This baby would be a living reminder of what had been done to her. This baby would tie her to Thomas Jefferson for the rest of her life. Sally named her son Thomas, though everyone called him Tom. The baby was healthy and strong, and Sally recovered quickly from the birth. She was young and resilient, her body bouncing back from the trauma of childbirth with the ease of youth. Thomas visited the cabin once the day after the birth. He stayed for less than 5 minutes. He looked at the baby, said nothing, and left. He never held his son. He never acknowledged him publicly, but he made arrangements. Sally and her baby were moved to a better cabin, one with 2 rooms instead of 1, with a proper fireplace and wooden floors and real windows with glass instead of shutters. Sally was given a small allowance, a few coins each month, unheard of for an enslaved person. She was provided with better clothing, better food, better everything. And it was quietly understood, though never officially stated, that Sally's children would never be sold, would never be separated from her, would be treated differently than other enslaved children at Monticello. These were not kindnesses, they were payments, compensation for silence, a transaction between a man with absolute power and a woman with none, because Sally knew what had happened to Martha. Sally had been there at Shadwell Mills during those first terrible weeks of Martha's imprisonment. She had been forced to serve Martha, to bring her food and water, to clean up after her, to listen to her ravings and her pleas. And Sally had heard things that no one else had heard. Confessions, threats, plans for revenge that Martha whispered in her lucid moments, plans that terrified Sally because she knew Martha was capable of carrying them out even in her broken state. Martha knew about the pregnancy. Martha knew the baby was Thomas's. And Martha had promised Sally that she would make them both pay, that she would find a way to expose the truth, that she would destroy Thomas's reputation, even if it cost her own life. Sally was terrified. She had no power to protect herself or her baby. She was completely dependent on Thomas's goodwill, and she knew that goodwill could evaporate at any moment. She had seen what Thomas did to Martha when Martha became inconvenient. What would he do to Sally if she became a threat? So Sally stayed quiet. She accepted the better cabin and the small allowance and the promises about her children. She played the role of the grateful slave, the willing mistress, the woman who had no complaints about her situation. She buried her fear and her anger and her knowledge deep inside where no one could see it. But she never forgot, and she never forgave. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. The official cause of death was listed as complications from childbirth. The delivery of Lucy Elizabeth 15 months earlier had weakened her beyond recovery, and she had finally succumbed to the long decline. But the timing was suspicious. Martha had survived for months in her deteriorated condition, clinging to life with a tenacity that surprised everyone. Why did she die precisely when she did? Just as her sister Elizabeth was planning another visit to Monticello, just as questions about her condition were becoming harder to deflect, just as the fiction of her illness was becoming impossible to maintain, the servants who prepared Martha's body for burial noticed things that disturbed them. They whispered about these things among themselves, but never to anyone outside the slave community. They knew better than to voice suspicions about a master's behavior. Betty Brown, who had served Martha for years, was one of the women who washed and dressed the body. She noticed bruises on Martha's arms, dark purple marks that looked like fingerprints, as if someone had held her down with considerable force. She noticed a strange smell on Martha's breath, bitter and chemical, not the usual smell of laudanum. And she noticed Martha's face frozen in an expression that was not peaceful repose, but something closer to terror, her eyes wide and her mouth open as if she had died in the middle of a scream. Grace, the midwife, was called to examine the body. She had experience with death, having attended many deathbeds over her long life. She looked at Martha's body with the practiced eye of someone who knew what to look for. Then she pulled Thomas aside and spoke to him in a low voice that no one else could hear. What she told him was never recorded, but Thomas's reaction was noted by several people. He went pale, stumbled, and had to sit down. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had just received terrible news or been confronted with a terrible truth. He dismissed Grace immediately, sending her back to the quarters with instructions not to speak of what she had seen. He ordered that Martha be buried within 24 hours before the body could deteriorate further in the September heat. This was unusual. Wealthy families typically held the body for several days, allowing time for relatives to arrive and pay their respects. There would be a viewing, a funeral service, a proper mourning period. But Thomas insisted on immediate burial, citing the heat and Martha's condition and the need to spare the family additional grief. The funeral was small and rushed. A few family members, a few close friends, a minister who read from the Bible in a perfunctory manner. The coffin was closed. Thomas said that Martha's appearance would be too distressing for the family to see. No one was allowed to view the body one last time. Elizabeth Epps arrived just as the coffin was being lowered into the ground. She had ridden hard from her home, having received word of Martha's death only the day before. She was furious that she hadn't been notified earlier, that she hadn't been given time to say goodbye, that her sister was being buried with such unseemly haste. She demanded to see Martha's body one last time. She wanted to see her sister's face, to say a proper goodbye, to confirm that Martha was really dead and not just being hidden away again. Thomas refused. He said the coffin had been sealed, that Martha's body was not in a condition to be viewed, that it would be too traumatic for Elizabeth to see. He said that Elizabeth needed to trust him, that he had Martha's best interests at heart, that everything had been done properly. They argued beside the grave, their voices rising, the other Moors watching in uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth accused Thomas of hiding something. Thomas accused Elizabeth of being hysterical with grief. The argument grew heated, ugly, threatening to become a public scandal. Finally, Thomas played his final card. He reminded Elizabeth of the provisions in his will. He reminded her that her children's futures depended on his generosity, that he had made arrangements to ensure their financial security, that these arrangements could be changed if Elizabeth proved to be difficult. He reminded her that spreading rumors about Martha's death would destroy not only his reputation, but her own family's prospects, that society would not look kindly on a woman who accused her brother-in-law of impropriety without proof. The threat was clear. Silence could be bought. Cooperation would be rewarded. Interference would be punished. Elizabeth stepped back from the grave. She watched her sister being buried in silence, her face a mask of grief and rage and helplessness. She watched the earth being shoveled onto the coffin, burying Martha forever, burying the truth along with her. And then she left Monticello and never returned. She cut off all contact with Thomas Jefferson. She refused to visit. She refused to correspond. She refused to allow her children to have any relationship with their uncle. For the rest of her life, she maintained a cold, distant silence that spoke volumes about what she believed had happened to her sister. But before she left, she did one thing that would echo through history. She took Martha's diary. Martha had kept a journal for years, recording her thoughts, her fears, her observations about life at Monticello. It was a small leather-bound book that she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. She had written in it almost every day, documenting her life in careful detail, the births of her children, the deaths of loved ones, her struggles with illness, her observations about Thomas and his work and his character, and in the final months she had written about Sally Hemings, about the pregnancy, about her confrontation with Thomas, about what had happened to her at Shadwell Mills. Thomas had searched for the diary after Martha's death, intending to destroy it. He had gone through Martha's room methodically, looking in every drawer, every trunk, every possible hiding place, but he couldn't find it. The diary had disappeared. Elizabeth had been faster, while Thomas was occupied with funeral arrangements, while everyone was distracted by grief and logistics. Elizabeth had gone to Martha's room. She knew about the loose floorboard. Martha had shown it to her years ago when they were girls sharing secrets. She had retrieved the diary and hidden it in her own belongings, and she had taken it with her when she left Monticello. The diary was never published. Elizabeth kept it hidden for the rest of her life, locked in a trunk in her attic. When she died in 1811, she passed it to her daughter with strict instructions that it should never be read by anyone outside the family, that it contained information too dangerous to reveal, that it could destroy reputations and ruin lives even decades after the events described. The diary passed through several generations of the Appices family, each keeper adding their own note, confirming that the contents were too disturbing to make public. It became a family secret, a burden passed from mother to daughter, a testament to something terrible that had happened but could never be spoken of. In 1873, 91 years after Martha's death, the diary was finally destroyed. Martha's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Caroline Epps Harrison, burned it in her fireplace. She sat up all night reading the diary page by page and then feeding each page to the flames, watching the secrets turn to ash. But before she burned it, she wrote a letter to her sister describing what she had found. That letter survived. It's now in a private collection held by descendants of the Epps family, never displayed publicly, never discussed in official Jefferson scholarship. Access to it is restricted, and researchers who request to see it are usually denied. But a few historians have been allowed to read the letter under strict conditions of confidentiality. They report that it contains allegations so disturbing that they cannot be published even now, more than 2 centuries after the events described. The letter mentions Shadwell Mills. It mentions Sally Hemings and the baby. It mentions things that were done to Martha during her imprisonment, methods used to break her will and ensure her silence. And it mentions Martha's final words spoken to Thomas on the night before she died. According to the letter, Martha called Thomas to her room and spoke to him with a clarity she hadn't shown in months. The laudanum had worn off, and her mind was clear for the first time since her return from Shadwell Mills. She told him that she knew what he had done to her. She told him that she would never forgive him. She told him that she had written everything down, that the truth would survive even if she didn't, that his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would eventually know what kind of man he really was. And then she said, "You sent me away to hide your shame, but shame has a way of surviving. Your children will know, history will know, and you will never escape what you've done." Those were her last words. She died that night alone in her locked room with only Mrs. Randolph present. The nurse's official report said that Martha died peacefully in her sleep, but the letter from Caroline Epps Harrison suggests otherwise. It suggests that Martha's death was not natural, that steps were taken to ensure she would never speak again, that the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. But there is no proof. There is only suspicion. Whispers, a letter that few people have read and fewer still believe. After Martha's death, Thomas Jefferson destroyed almost everything connected to her. He burned her letters, hundreds of them, correspondence with family and friends spanning years. He burned her personal papers, her sketches, her music. He burned her clothing, saying he couldn't bear to see it. He removed her portraits from the walls and stored them in the attic, where they gathered dust for decades. He forbade anyone in the household from speaking her name, saying that it was too painful for him to hear. He was erasing her from history, just as he had erased those 3 months when she disappeared. He was creating a narrative in which Martha was a tragic figure, a beloved wife who died young, a victim of illness rather than a woman who had been systematically destroyed by her husband's betrayal and cruelty. The official record of Martha Jefferson's life is remarkably sparse. We know the dates of her birth and death. We know she married Thomas Jefferson in 1772. We know she bore 6 children, only 2 of whom survived to adulthood. We know she died at 33, supposedly from complications of childbirth. But we know almost nothing about who she was as a person. Her letters were destroyed. Her diary was destroyed. Her voice was silenced both during her life and after her death. She exists in history as a shadow, a footnote in the story of a great man, a wife who had the misfortune to die young and leave her husband free to pursue his destiny. Sally Hemings remained at Monticello for the rest of Thomas Jefferson's life. She bore him 6 children in total, though only 4 survived to adulthood.
The children were named Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston.
They all had light skin, light enough to pass for white, and they all bore a striking resemblance to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas never acknowledged them publicly. He never freed Sally during his lifetime, but he made provisions for her children in his will, freeing them when they came of age. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to run away in their early 20s, disappearing into white society and never looking back. Madison and Eston were formally freed after Thomas's death. Sally herself was never formally freed. Instead, she was allowed to walk away after Thomas died in 1826. A legal fiction that gave her freedom without the official documentation that might raise questions about why she, alone among hundreds of enslaved people, received this privilege. She lived with her sons Madison and Eston in Charlottesville until her death in 1835. She never spoke publicly about her relationship with Thomas Jefferson. She never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never confirmed or denied the rumors that had followed her for decades. She maintained a dignified silence that protected her children and preserved what little privacy she had. But she told her children stories. She told them about their father, about life at Monticello, about the complicated reality of being enslaved by the man who fathered your children. She told them about Martha Jefferson, about what had happened in 1782, about the terrible price Martha paid for discovering the truth. And her children told their children, and those stories survived even when the official history tried to bury them. The Hemings descendants maintained for generations that they were descended from Thomas Jefferson, that Sally Hemings had been his concubine, that the relationship had begun when Sally was just a teenager and had continued for decades, for 200 years, the CLA. IMS were dismissed by historians and Jefferson scholars. They said the stories were impossible. that a man of Jefferson's stature would never engage in such behavior, that the Hemings family was lying or mistaken or trying to claim a connection to greatness that they didn't deserve. But in 1998, DNA testing proved what the Hemings family had been saying all along. Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one of Sally Hemings's children, and probably all of them. The genetic evidence was undeniable. The official history had been wrong. The family stories had been right. The stone house at Shadwell Mills burned down in 1790, 8 years after Martha's death. The fire was ruled accidental, a lightning strike during a summer storm. According to the official report, the house was completely destroyed. The stone walls cracked by the heat. The roof collapsed. Everything inside reduced to ash, but the timing was suspicious. The fire occurred just days after a former Monticello servant was seen in the area asking questions about the property's history. The servant, a man named Peter Fawcett, who had been sold away from Monticello years earlier, had returned to Virginia and was trying to piece together what had happened to Martha Jefferson. He had heard stories in the slave community, fragments of truth that had been passed down through whispers and coded conversations. He went to Shadwell Mills to see the place for himself to look for evidence of what had happened there. He was seen by local residents asking about the stone house, trying to find people who remembered 1782. 3 days later, the house burned and Peter Fawcett disappeared. His body was never found. His family never heard from him again. Whether he died in the fire or whether he met with an accident shortly after or whether he was killed to silence him, no one knows. The fire destroyed whatever evidence might have remained. D. at Shadwell Mills. The scratches on the walls that Martha had made with her fingernails, the locks on the doors and windows, any physical trace of the 3 months Martha spent imprisoned there. All of it was reduced to ash and rubble. The property was abandoned after the fire. The ruins of the stone house were left to be reclaimed by the forest. Within a generation, few people remembered that Shadwell Mills had ever existed. It disappeared from maps, from records, from memory. Another piece of evidence erased. Another chapter of the story buried. Thomas Jefferson went on to become the 3rd president of the United States, serving from 1801 to 1809. He wrote eloquently about liberty and equality while owning over 600 human beings during his lifetime. He spoke of the evils of slavery while fathering children with an enslaved woman who had no legal right to refuse him. He championed education and enlightenment while systematically destroying evidence of his own crimes. He lived to be 83 years old, dying on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. His death was celebrated as the passing of a founding father, a philosopher, president, one of the great men who shaped America's ideals. He was mourned across the nation. Eulogies praised his intellect, his vision, his contributions to American democracy. No one mentioned Martha. No one mentioned Sally. No one mentioned the 3 months in 1782 when a woman disappeared and returned broken. No one mentioned the stone house in the mountains where terrible things happened. No one mentioned the diary that was hidden and eventually burned. No one mentioned the truth that had been so carefully buried. Thomas Jefferson took his secrets to the grave, and for 200 years those secrets stayed buried. But secrets don't die as easily as people. They linger in the spaces between official records. T. Hey, survive in family stories and whispered rumors and letters that are read once and then hidden away. They persist in the DNA that connects descendants across centuries. They emerge in the gaps and silences of the historical record, in the questions that historians can't answer, in the documents that were destroyed and the voices that were silenced. Martha Jefferson vanished for 3 months in 1782. The official record says she was receiving medical treatment in Richmond, but the official record is a lie carefully constructed by a man who understood that history is written by those with the power to control the narrative. The truth is darker and more human. Martha discovered her husband's relationship with an enslaved girl who was her own half-sister. She confronted him with evidence of Sally's pregnancy, and Thomas, faced with a choice between his wife and his reputation, chose to remove Martha from society until she could be broken into silence. What happened in that stone house during those 3 months? What methods were used to transform a strong-willed woman into the hollow ghost who returned to Monticello? Did Thomas visit her there? Did he explain, justify, apologize, or did he simply leave her in isolation until her mind shattered under the weight of betrayal and imprisonment? We will never know for certain. The people who could have told us are long dead, and the records that might have revealed the truth were systematically destroyed. The stone house burned, the diary burned, the witnesses were sold away or silenced or disappeared. Every piece of evidence was carefully eliminated. Every voice that might have spoken the truth was suppressed. But we know this: Martha Jefferson died at 33. Her health destroyed, her spirit broken, her story erased. Sally Hemings lived to be 62, bearing the children of the man who had imprisoned her mistress, carrying secrets she would never fully reveal. And Thomas Jefferson lived to be 83, celebrated as a founding father, his reputation intact, his crimes forgotten. History remembers him as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the champion of liberty, the philosopher-president who shaped America's ideals. His face is carved into Mount Rushmore. His memorial stands in Washington, D.C. His words are quoted in every discussion of American values and democratic principles. History has forgotten Martha Jefferson almost entirely. She exists in the record as a footnote, a wife who died young, a tragedy that humanized the great man. Most people don't even know her name. Most biographies of Thomas Jefferson devote only a few pages to her, focusing on her death rather than her life, treating her as a plot point in his story rather than a person with her own story to tell. But Martha was not a footnote. She was a woman who discovered a terrible truth and paid for that discovery with her freedom, her sanity, and ultimately her life. She was a woman who tried to fight back against a system that gave her husband absolute power over her body, her children, and her fate. She was a woman who refused to stay silent, who wrote down the truth, even knowing it might never be read, who promised that history would eventually know what had been done to her. She was a woman who vanished not into death, but into something worse, into deliberate erasure, into the blank pages of her husband's journal, into the silence that powerful men impose when the truth becomes inconvenient. The baby Sally bore in July of 1782, the boy named Thomas, died in infancy. The official record says he died of whooping cough, a common childhood disease, but the timing is notable. The child died in late September, just weeks after Martha returned to Monticello during the period when Martha was heard screaming threats in AC. Accusations through the night. Did Martha find a way to strike back at Sally to punish the girl who had replaced her in her husband's affections? Did she use what little power she had left to harm the baby, to take revenge on the living symbol of her husband's betrayal? Or did Thomas remove the evidence of his crime, sacrificing his own child to protect his reputation, to eliminate the most visible proof of his relationship with Sally? We don't know. We can never know. The people who could tell us chose silence, chose survival, chose to bury the truth so deep that it would take centuries to unearth even fragments of it. But the questions remain. They echo through the halls of Monticello, through the pages of history books that tell only part of the story, through the DNA evidence that finally in 1998 confirmed what Sally Heming descendants had been saying for 200 years. Thomas Jefferson fathered children with an enslaved woman. He used his power to control her, to silence her, to ensure that she could never tell the full truth about their relationship. He used that same power to control his wife, to imprison her, to break her when she threatened to expose him. And before Sally, there was Martha. Martha who knew. Martha who confronted him. Martha who disappeared for 3 months and returned as a broken shell of herself. Martha who died under suspicious circumstances just when her continued existence was becoming inconvenient. Martha who was erased from history as thoroughly as if she had never existed. The red clay of Virginia holds many secrets. The foundations of Monticello were built by enslaved hands, and those hands buried truths that were never meant to surface. The house stands today as a monument to Thomas Jefferson's genius, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. Tour guides speak of Jefferson's architectural innovation, his intellectual achievements, his contributions to American democracy. They mention Sally Hemings now briefly, acknowledging the relationship that was denied for so long. They talk about the complexity of Jefferson's legacy, the contradiction between his words about freedom and his actions as a slaveholder. They present it as a historical puzzle, a philosophical dilemma, an interesting footnote to a great man's story. But they don't talk about Martha. They don't talk about the 3 months she disappeared. They don't talk about the stone house in the mountains where she was held prisoner. They don't talk about the diary that was hidden and burned. They don't talk about the suspicious circumstances of her death. They don't talk about the systematic erasure of her story from the historical record, because Martha's story is not a footnote. It's not a puzzle or a dilemma or an interesting historical detail. It's a crime. It's the story of a woman who was imprisoned, tortured, and possibly murdered by her husband because she threatened to expose his secrets. It's the story of power used to silence truth, of history rewritten to protect the guilty, of a woman's voice stolen and her story erased. But erasure is never complete. There are always traces, always fragments, always whispers that survive. The blank pages in Jefferson's journal, the letters that were destroyed but whose existence was recorded, the family stories passed down through generations. The DNA evidence that proved the official history wrong. The letter describing Martha's diary, hidden in a private collection, read by only a few people, but confirming that the truth was written down, even if it was later destroyed. Martha Jefferson vanished in the spring of 1782. She returned 3 months later, scarcely recognizable, an empty husk of the woman she had been. 6 months after that, she was dead, her silence, sealed in the grave. Thomas Jefferson believed the truth had been buried with her. He was wrong. Secrets do not stay buried. Like bodies, they surface. Truth has a patience that outlives those who try to suppress it. More than 2 centuries later, we are finally able to reconstruct what happened to Martha Jefferson. The missing pieces in the historical record are no longer invisible. We can see now that they were carved out with intent. The silences were manufactured, the omissions deliberate. We can read official papers not just for what they say, but for what they carefully avoid. We can hear the voices that were dismissed for generations and recognize them not as rumor, but as witness. We can examine the DNA evidence and understand that it confirms more than a relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. It exposes an entire structure of power, coercion, and exploitation that made such a relationship inevitable. And we can remember Martha Jefferson not as an aside in a famous man's life, but as a woman in her own right, a woman who loved deeply, suffered quietly, and resisted in the only ways available to her. A woman undone by the man who professed devotion to her, erased by the author of liberty, silenced by the champion of human rights. This is her story. This is what happened when a wife uncovered her husband's betrayal and refused to accept it in silence. This is what happened when a woman endangered the carefully constructed reputation of a powerful man. This is what happens when truth becomes inconvenient. When it must be hidden, buried, denied. This is the story Thomas Jefferson tried to remove from history, but it endured. It survived in fragments and whispers, in missing letters and destroyed documents, in unanswered questions that historians could not resolve, in family histories long dismissed as false and later proven true by science itself. And now you know. You know what happened to Martha Jefferson in 1782. You know why she vanished for 3 months. You know why she returned broken. You know why her death raised unanswered questions. You know why her story was erased. You know the truth Thomas Jefferson spent the rest of his life trying to conceal.